It was supposed to be just another peaceful weekend at the lake cabin. I had driven up Friday night, windows down, music low, just enjoying the breeze off the water. The cabin sat quiet and still like always, nestled under the trees like a hidden secret from the world. This place had been in my family for years, passed down from my grandfather who bought the land before there was ever a single HOA in sight. I knew every inch of the property, every stone in the path, every board on the dock. It was my sanctuary. But that morning, the peace shattered with a knock at the door. It wasn't a friendly neighbor or a lost tourist. Standing on my porch was a man in an HOA windbreaker, flanked by two other board members who looked like they just walked out of a country club brochure. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses too big for the overcast morning, and that smug smile that immediately told me this wasn't a social visit. He introduced himself as the HOA enforcement officer, a title that already made my blood pressure rise, and without much of a greeting, he handed me a thick envelope. I hadn't even taken a sip of coffee yet. I opened it slowly, already expecting trouble. Inside were several typed pages, covered in legal jargon, references to bylaws I'd never seen before, and at the top in bold, notice of eviction. According to them, I had 72 hours to vacate my cabin. They claimed I had violated shared use policies, failed to obtain occupancy approval, and that I was trespassing on HOA-controlled land. I laughed at first, thinking it had to be a mistake. A prank maybe. But no, they were serious. Dead serious. He started reading off violations like he was reciting scripture. Unapproved structures on HOA property. Improper use of lakefront land. Failure to comply with community regulations. I interrupted him, calmly at first, asking what exactly gave them jurisdiction over my family's property. That's when he handed me a map. A rough sketch, printed in grayscale, showing the HOA's claimed boundaries. And to my complete disbelief, they had drawn a box right over my cabin. Not beside it, not bordering it, directly over it, as if the cabin didn't exist or had been built illegally. I stared at them for a long second, the weight of what they were trying to pull sinking in. This wasn't some innocent paperwork mistake. This was a power move, a bluff. Maybe they had bullied someone else out of a property before. Maybe someone hadn't had the means to fight back. But they didn't know who they were dealing with this time. I asked if they had any official county records to back up their claims. They shifted a little. One of the women with him started nervously thumbing her phone. The lead guy, though, didn't flinch. He told me that in accordance with our governing documents, the board had every right to reclaim any property that had fallen into non-compliance. He said they had voted on it unanimously last week. Like that meant something to me. Like their vote could override legal ownership. What got me most wasn't even the threat of eviction. It was the arrogance. The way they assumed I'd roll over and just hand it all back. My lake cabin. My land. My dock. Like it was some club membership they could cancel. Like they owned the whole shoreline and I was just squatting there on borrowed time. They had no idea I wasn't just some tenant. I wasn't renting a space or living under some lease agreement. I owned this land outright, every inch of it. But in that moment, I realized something else. This wasn't just about me. If they could try to evict me from land I had owned for decades, who else had they pushed around? How many other neighbors had gotten the same envelope and just packed up without a fight? And how far were they willing to go? He told me I had 3 days to get out or they'd take further action. He actually said those words, further action, like I was some criminal hiding out. I didn't respond. I just told them I'd take a look at their paperwork and get back to them. They turned and walked back down the path like they had already won, like it was a done deal. But what they didn't realize was that by delivering that notice, they had just opened the wrong door. The next morning, I sat at my dining table, HOA letter in hand, flipping through the pages again with a growing mix of disbelief and anger. The accusations were laughable, but they weren't treating them like a joke. They genuinely believed they had the authority to dictate what I could and couldn't do on land that had been in my family longer than their HOA had even existed. The more I read, the more it became clear this wasn't just about enforcing rules. This was about control. They had decided that my cabin, my little slice of peace on the lake, no longer fit their image of the neighborhood, and they were going to use every trick in the book to force me out. Later that day, I got a knock on the door again. This time it wasn't the full trio from yesterday, just the same guy with a clipboard and a different woman from the HOA board. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pointed to the dock behind my cabin and asked whether I had a current use authorization for what he called shared access property. I blinked, genuinely confused because I had never heard those words strung together before. He went on to explain, in a tone that dripped with condescension, that the HOA maintained regulatory oversight of all waterfront access points within their development boundary, including what he called my encroaching dock. I looked back at the dock, the same wooden planks my grandfather had laid by hand 40 years ago. It hadn't changed. It hadn't expanded. It wasn't built over anyone else's property. It was simply mine. But according to them, my dock sat on land that belonged to the HOA, or at least, that's what they were trying to argue now. He pulled out a binder this time, flipping to a page that listed something called Regulation 4C, Private Use of Community Property. It was loaded with vague language about structures on lakefront land, the need for pre-approval for personal installations, and potential fines for unauthorized usage. He spoke as if every word were law, like he was reading from a courtroom verdict. I asked him to show me where in the county records the HOA's property lines extended to my dock. He told me I'd have to speak to the compliance officer for that. The woman with him finally chimed in. She mentioned complaint from other homeowners, anonymous of course, about how my cabin was visually inconsistent with the rest of the neighborhood. She said it created an aesthetic disruption to the community's waterfront view. I asked her if that was her way of saying they didn't like the color of my cabin, or maybe they didn't appreciate the stone fire pit I built last summer. She just smiled and said the HOA had standards and that my place didn't meet them. It was all so absurd I almost laughed, but I kept my composure. They kept tossing around words like compliance, violations, and removal order, but none of it was grounded in actual ownership. They wanted me to believe they had some higher authority simply because they represented the HOA. It became clear their goal wasn't just to force me to remove a dock or paint my cabin a different shade. They were trying to erase my presence entirely. They even claimed that I was illegally accessing a shared road to reach the cabin. According to their updated bylaws, the road had been designated as a private community route, and because I hadn't signed onto their agreement, an agreement I was never even shown, my continued use of the path was trespassing. I asked again if they could produce a recorded easement or document from the county that proved this road was within their jurisdiction. They didn't have it. What they had was confidence, a stack of paperwork, and the assumption that I would fold. He ended the visit by reminding me, not kindly, that non-compliance can result in forced removal, litigation, and penalties. Then he gave me a bright yellow notice to post in my window, marking my cabin as under review. I didn't put it up. It was already clear that they were trying to build a case around me, a case based on twisted interpretations of their own rules, none of which applied to the land I rightfully owned. They wanted me to panic, to pack up and leave, to treat their threats like gospel. But the more they talked, the more obvious it became. They weren't working with facts. They were working with fear. I knew from the moment they handed me that eviction notice that something wasn't adding up. These people were confident, too confident. They spoke like they owned everything they could see, like my cabin was just a blemish on their carefully curated HOA territory. But their arrogance didn't change the truth. I had grown up on this land. My grandfather had told me stories about buying it outright, long before anyone talked about community boards or mandatory dues. It wasn't just a memory. We had the paperwork to prove it. So I decided to dig. That evening, I pulled out the old family lockbox we kept in the back of the closet. Inside were stacks of yellowing documents, maps, old black and white photos of the land, even receipts for lumber purchased when the cabin was first built. Tucked between a folded deed and a lakefront maintenance receipt was a certified plat map, stamped, signed, and officially filed with the county. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing it over the dining table, and there it was, the boundaries, the coordinates, and right at the edge, the dock. Clearly marked, included in our parcel. No question, the land was mine. All of it. I took out the current property deed, one that had been updated after my father passed it on to me. The language was clear, and the metes and bounds matched the map perfectly. It extended right past the cabin, across the path the HOA now claimed was theirs, and even included a good portion of the lakefront where their so-called shared-use dock now sat. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very structure they used for their HOA meetings, holiday parties, and fishing tournaments was built on land that had been part of our parcel for decades. Not only did I own my cabin and dock, I also owned the ground under their beloved hangout spot. I decided to go even further just to be thorough. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. I handed over the documents and asked the clerk to pull up the official lot lines from the registry. After a few minutes of typing, she looked up and confirmed exactly what I already knew. The land the HOA claimed was theirs fell entirely within my legal property. There were no easements granted, no overlapping boundaries, no recorded agreements that would suggest shared access. According to the county, the lot was singular, privately owned, and had never been subdivided or turned over to any association. I asked for certified copies of every relevant document. The clerk printed them out, stamped and notarized. I left the office with a manila envelope full of legal proof that every claim the HOA made was built on air. They had no legal standing to evict me, to fine me, or even to step foot on certain parts of what they assumed was their territory. I got home and spread everything out on the kitchen table. Deeds from the 70s, surveyor maps, tax records, and even a few black and white photos that showed the dock standing exactly where it is now, long before any HOA homes were built nearby. I snapped photos of everything, scanned the documents, and organized them into folders, both digital and physical. If they wanted to fight, I wasn't going in unprepared. Then I thought about the dock. For years, the HOA had used it like it was part of the neighborhood. They tied up their boats, hosted summer events, even installed a few benches without asking anyone for permission. They must have just assumed it was part of the community layout. Or maybe they had always known it wasn't theirs but hoped no one would question it. That changed now. I traced the dock's outline on the surveyor's plat and highlighted the lakefront boundary. Not only was it within my parcel, it was completely outside of anything ever registered under the HOA's control. I realized then that their entire claim about shared-use property was based on nothing more than assumptions and wishful thinking. I knew what came next wouldn't be simple. HOAs rarely admit fault, and they weren't going to back down quietly. But I had something stronger than bluster and bylaws. I had irrefutable proof. They could wave their rule books all they wanted. None of it applied to me. I stood at the edge of the dock, the late afternoon sun casting a golden shimmer over the lake, and it hit me how absurd this entire situation had become. A week ago, I was just enjoying quiet weekends at my family's cabin, the same way we always had. Now, I was staring down an HOA board that had tried to erase decades of ownership with one printed notice and a lot of ego. But now I had something they didn't: truth, backed by documents, maps, legal filings, and signatures older than their entire subdivision. I didn't waste any time. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA. If they were going to keep pushing their narrative, I was going to shut it down face to face. When I showed up at the community center, they looked surprised. Maybe they thought I'd just disappear after their eviction threat. I walked in with a large folder in hand, thick with property deeds, county stamp surveys, tax assessments, and plat maps. The board sat there in a semicircle, all of them holding printed agendas and wearing expressions that mixed suspicion with forced politeness. They asked what I was there to discuss, and I slid the folder across the table. I told them I wanted to clarify something about their recent claims. One of the board members, a woman who had come to my cabin earlier in the week, opened the folder and started flipping through. I watched her face shift as she read. It wasn't long before she realized this wasn't just hearsay or a verbal disagreement. These were legally binding documents. My name was on the deed. My land extended to the dock. My family had never relinquished any portion of it to the HOA or its developers. What I presented wasn't opinion. It was legal reality. The man with the clipboard, who seemed to have taken the role of spokesperson, leaned forward and asked if I'd filed any of this with the county recently, as if he thought it was some kind of rushed counterclaim. I told him the oldest document in that folder was from 1979 and bore my grandfather's signature. Everything was already on file and had been for decades. Nothing about their maps or bylaws could override that. They asked about the dock, the same dock they'd use for their community events, fishing contests, and weekend get-togethers. I told them that it had always been part of our land and had never been designated for public or shared use. If they had been using it freely all these years, that was a courtesy, not a right. I watched as a few of them shifted in their chairs, clearly beginning to realize how deep they were in. One of them asked what my intention was. I found that ironic. After attempting to evict me, after falsely claiming authority over land they didn't own, after sending warnings, notices, and threats, they wanted to know my intention. I told them I had no problem with the community itself, but I wasn't going to sit back and let them dictate rules on land they didn't own. I didn't need their permission to stay on my property, and I certainly didn't need their oversight over the dock or the cabin. Their lawyer wasn't at the meeting, but they mentioned wanting to consult with legal counsel. I welcomed it. I said I'd be happy to sit down with attorneys present. Everything I had was already backed by county records and state property laws. They could get all the advice they wanted. The facts wouldn't change. The HOA didn't own my lot, and they never had. As the meeting dragged on, it became clear they were trying to save face. A few board members asked vague questions, trying to pick apart the documents or throw doubt on the survey. But every page they turned confirmed the same truth. They had no legal standing to control or threaten my use of the land. What they had was an inflated sense of authority built on years of unchecked power. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The documents did the talking for me. Their responses grew quieter, and the energy in the room shifted from confrontation to damage control. They began asking about reasonable arrangements, about possible coexistence. But it was too late for vague compromises. They had tried to remove me from my own land, accused me of violating rules that never applied, and embarrassed themselves with baseless claims. Now, they were realizing I held all the leverage, and they were the ones standing on ground they didn't own. It didn't take long for word to spread through the neighborhood. Once the board realized the truth about the land ownership, they didn't exactly send out a public apology, but the whispers started. Homeowners who had once casually nodded at me from across the lake started asking quiet questions, usually when no one else was around. Some of them had no idea the dock they'd been using for years didn't belong to the HOA. Others had long suspected the board was overreaching but hadn't wanted to rock the boat. Now that I had the proof and had made it known, the entire power dynamic started to shift. The dock became the flashpoint. It was more than just a wooden platform. It was where they hosted neighborhood events, sunset socials, and even HOA fundraisers. It had always been treated like community property, but now they were walking on eggshells. I could see it in the way they approached the area, slower, more cautious, looking over their shoulders as if expecting to be told to leave. For years, they acted like it was theirs. Now, they didn't know what to do without that illusion of ownership. The board sent me a letter, much more polite than the last one, asking if we could enter a discussion about shared access to the dock. They framed it as a cooperative proposal, highlighting the dock's importance to the community and how much the neighborhood had come to rely on it. They even suggested that I could become a community partner and that we could establish a mutual use agreement beneficial to all parties. It was almost amusing, considering these were the same people who had tried to throw me off my own land a week earlier. I didn't ignore the letter, but I didn't rush to respond either. I wanted them to sit with the discomfort, to feel what it was like to not be in control. Because for years, they had thrown their weight around, bullying residents, micromanaging yards, handing out fines like candy. And now, they were the ones asking for permission. I could have easily said no to everything, locked the dock down, and watched them panic. But I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in making sure this never happened again. Still, I needed to make it clear that things had changed. I posted a new sign at the entrance to the dock, private property, access by permission only. Nothing aggressive, nothing hostile, just a quiet reminder of reality. It didn't take long before the board responded, this time by calling an emergency meeting with the other residents. I didn't attend, but a friend who lived down the road filled me in. Apparently, the board was scrambling. Homeowners were asking questions the board didn't have answers for. Why hadn't they verified the dock's ownership before using it all these years? Why did they try to evict someone without doing due diligence? And most importantly, how much other property were they wrongly assuming belonged to the HOA? From that moment on, every interaction I had with the board felt different. There was no more smug confidence, no more veiled threats or clipboard inspections. They were cautious, polite to a fault. I even noticed a few of them trying to strike up small talk, as if pretending we were all just friendly neighbors with no past issues. But the dynamic had shifted, and we all knew it. They couldn't control what they didn't own, and now that their error had been exposed, their influence began to wane. What surprised me most were the neighbors who quietly thanked me. Some of them had been pressured by the HOA for years, told to remove sheds, repaint fences, change the color of their front doors. They were grateful someone finally stood up to the board and showed them that not all of their authority was legitimate. I hadn't planned to become some sort of figurehead for property rights, but the more people approached me with their own stories, the clearer it became this wasn't just about my land or my dock. This was about drawing a line between actual ownership and manufactured authority. The HOA had built their reputation on people not asking questions, on assuming that their rules were law. But now their bluff had been called. They couldn't host events without checking with me. They couldn't block off access or claim common ground where none existed. Their idea of control was slipping away, and they knew it. I didn't have to raise my voice or fight them in court to prove it. I just had to hold up the truth and let them fall over it themselves. After weeks of back and forth, it became obvious that the HOA wasn't going to admit they were wrong. Not openly, at least. They had gone quiet, stopped the surprise visits, and no more envelopes were being taped to my door. But the damage had been done. They had tried to push me off my own land, misused their authority, and underestimated just how much power a property owner truly has when they know their rights. What they didn't realize was that by trying to take everything from me, they had actually handed me something far more valuable: complete leverage. I wasn't just defending my rights anymore. I was rewriting the rules, and I was doing it on my terms. I started by getting everything formally recorded and re-verified with the county. I worked with a local land surveyor to mark the precise boundaries of my property, including the section of shoreline and the dock that had caused all the controversy. We placed new boundary markers, permanent and clearly visible, leaving no room for argument. I filed a notice of private ownership over the dock and requested that any future community activity requiring shoreline access through my land be formally cleared through me. There would be no more informal agreements, no more assumptions, and definitely no more HOA-hosted events on my property without permission. Then I began drafting my own access terms, not out of spite, but to establish a clear framework. If they wanted to use the dock for a community event, they had to submit a request at least 2 weeks in advance. I created a basic use agreement outlining expectations, liability clauses, and limits on occupancy and noise. I even required a refundable deposit for cleanup, just like they demanded from other residents for using HOA property. It was fair, professional, and fully within my rights. At first, they didn't take it seriously. The board ignored the documents and held an event on the dock without notifying me. So I contacted the sheriff's office and filed a formal trespass report. I didn't have to press charges. Just having an official record on file was enough to rattle them. Word spread quickly that I wasn't bluffing. I followed the law, stayed professional, and made it clear I wouldn't tolerate any more games. That single report was enough to put an end to the casual entitlement they had clung to for so long. With the dock locked down and the legal boundaries reinforced, the HOA found themselves boxed in. They no longer had unrestricted access to their favorite community spot, and the homeowners started noticing. People started asking why the annual fishing derby had been canceled or why the July 4th picnic had to be relocated. Every answer pointed back to one thing. The board had tried to evict someone who legally owned the very thing they depended on. And now, that someone was setting the rules. It didn't stop at the dock. I also submitted a formal cease and desist to the board, prohibiting them from distributing any further communications referencing my property as HOA-controlled land. They had to update their community map and remove my parcel from their digital boundary outlines. I contacted the title insurance companies the HOA worked with and provided copies of the land survey, making sure the correct lot lines were reflected on future documents. I wasn't just defending my rights anymore. I was protecting them from future manipulation. Neighbors who once avoided conflicts started coming by more often. Some wanted advice about their own property lines. Others just wanted to say thanks. Apparently, my situation had encouraged more than a few people to review their own deeds and question the HOA's authority. A few even asked if I would attend the next board meeting to help them push back on excessive fines and unapproved rule changes. I hadn't planned on becoming the neighborhood's unofficial advocate for homeowner rights, but the truth was someone needed to be. What started as an attempt to force me off my own land had completely backfired. The HOA had unintentionally exposed how fragile their control really was when confronted with facts and a little persistence. I wasn't aggressive. I wasn't rude. I was just prepared, and that made all the difference. I took the same clipboard mentality they had used against me and turned it into a system that actually respected boundaries, literal and legal. They may have started the fight thinking I was the problem, but they ended up facing the reality that I was the only one who had done their homework. The board backed off. Their tone changed. The threats stopped coming. But more importantly, the neighborhood changed too. People were no longer afraid to ask questions or challenge decisions. The HOA might still exist, but its grip was weaker, its reach limited. And it all started because someone finally said no and proved they had every right to.